So,
Nicely tell you.
yeah. So, maybe can you just start by telling us a bit about your job? How long have you been fire chief? What does being fire chief entail, and what's your jurisdiction?
Yeah, so I've been a firefighter now since 2000. I started as a volunteer, and I was lucky to be fortunate. Or I was fortunate to be hired as a career member as one of the fire inspectors in 2007. I was promoted to chief of fire prevention for in 2014, and became the Langford Fire Chief emergency program coordinator in 2017 upon the retirement of Chief Bob Beckett. We cover, approximately 45,000 people now in Langford that we're responsible for, and we're what's considered a full service fire department. So we respond to anything from typical house fires, medical calls, motor vehicle incidents, hazmat incidents, and we also have a technical rescue team that will go and perform high angle rope rescues off of Mount Finlayson or other areas. So it's quite a complex and broad part of our job. And but obviously one of the biggest concerns that we have in our area is the forest and the interface between our homes being built into right next to our forested areas. So we obviously want to make sure that we don't have wildfires that start outside our area come into Langford, and we don't want to see any fires that start in Langford heading out into causing big wildfires.
So for those of us who don't know anything really about interface fires, can you just talk about it as how big of a problem is it? What have the trends been in recent years?
Yeah, with the advent of climate change and the understanding of what that's causing changes to our own region, it's obviously becoming a greater and greater concern. Back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, most of BC wanted to build their homes into forested areas because that's a very unique feature that we have here in BC is the ability to do that. But as we're understanding now, after having some big wildfire seasons, we had a couple big ones in the early 2000s, but obviously 2017, 2018 were big wildfire years where we were setting records for the amount of forest burned as well as the amount of evacuees we were having. And so there's a greater understanding or sort of a greater need to understand the complexity of wildland interface fires and how we can protect our homes, how can we build our houses better, how can we make sure that we don't have situations where a simple campfire can turn into a 100,000 hectare fire that causes 50,000 people to have to be evacuated.
Right. And is that something that you have concerns about in Langford?
Yeah, definitely. The way that Langford's built is we have Goldstream Park around us. That covers the sort of the north west side of Langford is Goldstream Park, and then to our direct west and a little bit more to the south, we have Sioux Hills Regional Park, which is a very large area. And even in our south Langford, where we have borders up with Metchosin, which is a very rural area. So if you look around our borders, we're almost completely surrounded by parkland and large tracts of forest. So if something got going into that area, say a lightning strike or an unintended campfire, it would certainly grow out of control very fast and quickly threaten some of our neighboring communities that are right along the border and of these forested areas. So, it's as an emergency program coordinator, it's been designated as our number one greatest hazard to our community is a wildland interface fire.
Wow. And so, as you know, we're focusing on campfires and setting the potential of campfires to cause larger fires. And so, can you just talk about what you do right now to communicate to the public around wildfire risks, whether that's through signage, social media, talks, whatever it is that you do?
Yeah, I mean, certainly throughout the years, we try to change our messaging to the best that we can to meet the needs of the community. But something along a sign, those signs have been in place since probably the 70s and the 80s, and they haven't changed much because at the time they worked very well. But is that still a method that is working? We know, and we use a lot of social media now as a way to try to get our messaging across because we've started to find that even web pages aren't as effective as they once were. People aren't wanting to go and to search that information out themselves. A lot of cases, people want that information pushed to them. So we're trying to find new, innovative ways to be able to get our messaging across, and that it's going to resonate with people. It's one thing to read the message, but it has to have a sense of importance for somebody to recognize and go, oh, that's something I need to look at myself, or that's a behavior I need to change from. And that's it's difficult, through different generations and through different forms of media. What is the most effective method to get our messaging across to people?
Thank you. Can you give us as detailed a picture as possible of what's currently in place? So you say that there's signs. Like, where are the signs? What are they? What do they say? And then let's go through, what you do with web, social media, all of it. But starting with signs.
Okay, well, there's a number of signs. Typically, they're on very high traffic areas. They're managed by the province. So for the local one with us, we've got one by Thetis Lake that's on the Trans-Canada Highway. But most fire departments, including our own, we do have our own signs that we also will post the wildfire rating on. The Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure also has the big signs they have over top of the highway. They'll have messaging like when the road closures and stuff. They will also usually talk about a messaging for wildfire interface and during the peak wildfire season.
Okay, and what does the sign say? Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, they typically will just say it'll be a prevention message on those signs. The ones that over across the highway, it'll be typically something like call Zenith 555 to report wildfires, or wildfire conditions extreme, use caution and forest, or something along those lines. It's a very, very quick message because people are driving, so you can't have something too long. Whereas the fire halls will typically talk about the wildfire rating, and then there'll usually be another message that will be more of the prevention side of it. So don't toss cigarette butts out, make sure campfires are extinguished, things like that. Where social media, we can get a little bit more interactive. We can have videos, or we can demonstrate in some fashion why it's important, and or we can use local media, things like TV stations and radio stations, to either come and do stories. And that's typically what we'll do in around May, is when we know things are starting to dry out, we'll contact local media, or they'll contact us, and we'll do some local stories to be able to allow the messaging to be important to our local residents. They might see wildfires going on in the interior, but if nothing's happening here locally, then the message is kind of lost. So when we know that the conditions are really drying out here locally, then we'll do some demonstrations, and they'll film it to be able to show that, yes, even here on the island, and it's starting to dry out, and we need to take caution.
Okay. So when you're advising people to take caution, what kind of things do you say to that you hope they will heed?
Yeah, I mean, the two biggest causes of fires for us is discarded cigarettes and unintended campfires. So typically we'll focus on those types of messages. We normally will start off with discarded cigarettes, because that's our first indication when we start getting what we call nuisance fires. They're fires in flower beds and little grass fires. Then we'll get the unintended campfires, which are usually more of a problem for us because they can be much faster, and they're usually in fairly remote areas. So the fires are fairly significant by the time we get to them. And if we're getting to them in May, when the wildfire conditions are at moderate or even at high, we can typically get to them before they rage out of control. But as soon as we hit high and extreme, or we've been in high and extreme for a while, then a campfire that's been left in the woods and not seen for some time. By the time it's seen, it's usually something that is requiring all of our resources, probably some of our mutual aid partners and the BC Forest Service to extinguish. And they can grow from a campfire size fire to a several hectare fire in a matter of minutes.
Okay. So in terms of getting the message out there, is there someone who works with you whose job it is? Like, who puts this on, let's say, Twitter? What social media do you use? Who updates the webpage? How do you make decisions around that?
That's a great question. Most fire departments don't have what we call a public information officer. that's very common for a large department in say like Vancouver or departments in the States. But most of our departments here locally, certainly Langford and the West Shore are all composite fire departments. So it's a mix of career and volunteer, which means we don't typically have a lot of staff to be able to manage our social media accounts um, as effectively as we would like to in order to get our messaging out. And so it's usually one of our fire prevention officers, and it's typically our messaging is reactive, which is unfortunate. We'd rather be proactive in getting messages out on a daily basis to inform people that the conditions are changing. Normally, we've had a number of fires, and we're sending out a message to say, "Hey, we've had a number of fires. We need to make people to be more cautious, and here's how you can do that."
Okay, but that would be important for the students to know that your resources are limited. So if they design some really labor-intensive campaign, you need something that would be easily executed.
Yeah, that certainly would be very helpful for us, and because obviously it depends too on all the other calls that are going on. If we end up getting a couple really busy weeks, that means that maybe nobody's looking at our social media stuff or putting out new messages for some time. So it's kind of a catch-22 when it's slow and we have time for social media. We're probably not. There's no real messaging to send out there. But then when we start getting busy and we need to get the messages out there, we're too busy to actually go out and put those messages. So yeah, something that's simple, something that's catchy, and something that resonates with people is going to help us out greatly.
And how about outreach? I think in the old days there used to be, firefight kids would come to the fire station or that kind of thing. What are the outreach activities?
Yeah, we used to have a junior firefighting program that, again, it became hard to manage with staffing. We are looking at restarting that, though, and one of the things that we're meeting tomorrow about is a Juan de Fuca Fire Academy. So it's like a cadet camp where students would sign up for on spring break, and they would be able to then go to one of the local fire halls for a week, and they would basically run like they were a firefighter recruit and do like a boot camp kind of scenario, and be able to get exposed to a lot of the different things that we do with firefighting. So all the things I mentioned earlier, like the tech rescue, the hazmat, the fires, the motor vehicle incidents, they would get some hands-on experience to that. So some great opportunities out there, and yeah, we're hopeful that some of these initiatives will get off the ground again.
And how old would these kids be?
I would expect the cadet camp to be like 16 to 18. I know our junior program was 16 to 18, and a lot of departments use it, especially the smaller departments, will use it as a way to get interested people at 16 to 18 in the hopes that when they turn 19, they'll become an active volunteer and remain with the community. And then they've got somebody that's got some training and some experience and is able to help out right away. It's very difficult to attract volunteer firefighters nowadays. It's a very demanding, almost a full-time job on top of your full-time job, and so it becomes difficult. But certainly anybody that's got an interest in getting into the fire service as a career, these are great opportunities and steps to be able to help them.
Okay, thank you. Let's focus in on young campfire setters now. What are some typical situations that you've seen where youth are setting fires?
Well, certainly in the Langford area, we've grown up quite rapidly, and so a lot of places that youth like to go and hang out, they don't want to necessarily be seen in the public eye. So where do they go? Typically, they'll head out into some of our forested areas just so they can get a little bit of privacy and they can party and not have to worry about being harassed in any way. And while that's great that we've got areas around us that can facilitate that kind of activity, it also creates a big challenge when that activity is associated with both alcohol and with campfires, and that sometimes isn't a great mix because and especially when you go out in the middle of nowhere, you don't have any means to put the fire out. So it does combined become risky behavior, and if you're not understanding the wildfire conditions, and well, it may have rained earlier in the day and you think that everything is fine because this fire can't escape, Now all of a sudden we're actually, in extreme, and that rain didn't do anything to lower the fire risk, and the unattended fire will, easily in some wind, pick up, escape the little guard that you've put up around it, and become a big problem because you've gone further into the woods to get away from the public. Now that's further away from water, it's further away from access, and we're having to call in helicopters almost immediately to fight the fires.
So, can you talk about specifically what people might not know when they're in the woods? So, for example, you mentioned that people might think that because it rained that day, there's a reduced fire risk. Or you mentioned that people might put a little guard about their fire, but maybe that's not effective, or maybe they don't even know to do that. So, can you just talk about what are some common points of ignorance that you've noticed in terms of people, and most specifically youth, setting fires?
Yeah, a campfire in your backyard is different than a campfire that's in a forest setting. And the biggest thing with your backyard is, typically you've got wet green grass. You water your lawn. You've got clearances around, and you've got access to a garden hose or buckets to be able to put the fire out. None of those things exist in the forest setting. And as well, southern Vancouver Island, we know typically that we get a lot of wind. And while it may not be windy at the time you have the fire, the wind could pick up. And so what you think is out because there's no actual visible flame doesn't mean that fire is extinguished. There's still coals and ember. If there's any sort of heat, then the chances are that fire can rekindle with a little bit of wind. And then those sparks start to travel into the forest area, and sparks can travel sometimes kilometers at a time. And so even the fire that you had, the actual source of ignition is maybe kilometers away from where the fire actually starts. We may get a fire, again, sometimes 400 or 500 meters away from a campfire, because that's where the wind picked up the embers and tossed them into the forest.
Okay. And so is that, so would you say that people, so not putting, so there's two things. There's one, while a fire is burning, there's a risk, but then there's also while a fire is out. Could you just talk about the differences between each of those risks, in terms of what kids should be thinking about when they go in the woods?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, my preference would be no campfires in the woods. But we've got two different situations. One is it's the behavior itself. So there always is a possibility while you're sitting around a campfire that the flames or the sparks could end up causing a fire, and you may not know it. You may leave the site. You may fully extinguish that fire, but you may not have seen the embers going into the woods, some distance away, and you walk away from the fire and not knowing that there's a potential that it's going to pick up and take off. And there's also then the other part of it where you have no means to put the fire out. Even if the fire starts to get away from you, there's no mechanism. Not too many people are carrying shovels and things into the woods and not buckets of water. And I think there's maybe a misperception of how much water it actually takes to fully extinguish a fire. It's not just darkening it down so that there's no visible flames. It's actually fully extinguishing it. And we have a little bit of saying, the recipe to extinguish a campfire is add water and stir till cold, because you actually need to be able to remove all heat from the embers in order to make sure that fire is fully extinguished. So that's not just a couple little water bottles on the fire to make sure there's no flames. That's actually buckets of water to the point where you put your hand into all the ash at the bottom and there's no heat. And
Right.
that's not typical, that someone would carry that much stuff into the woods for them. So like I said, it's actually two different risk behaviors. It's the fire itself during the fire and not being able to control the sparks, and it's also not fully extinguishing it.
So when you say that your preference would be that no one sets a fire in the woods, would that be a realistic thing for these students to try to persuade through their responses to the challenge? Would that be a realistic thing to just get people to stop setting fires in the woods, or do you think that that's just not that it's a better, in terms of the goals, getting people to stop fires versus getting them to use fires safely? Where do you fall in terms of where the focus should be?
I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to advocate that there's a safe way of doing it out in the woods. and that well, you just do this, this, and this, and therefore you can safely have a fire in the woods. I mean, I think that would be irresponsible for me to advocate for that, but I also think it would be irresponsible for me to say that just by simply doing this exercise that they would never have a fire in the woods, because obviously it's happening and people are continuing to do it. I think the goal is to understand that the risk behind it. Again, even if in low wildfire conditions, you can still have a campfire get away from you and still cause a significant problem. So I think the goal would be to build an awareness as to, gee, this is a really risky behavior and we shouldn't be doing it. And if we are going to do it, what do we need to do? What do we need to think about in order to make sure that we don't make this fire become a big problem for local residents?
What are the legalities around that? So if kids went into the woods and started a fire, or let's say people who are 18 above age, what are the legal risks?
The province has been successful in suing people for the cost of the fire suppression, which can run into the millions and millions of dollars. Now, obviously, they wouldn't be able to recoup, $18 billion worth of, fire suppression kind of thing. But, there certainly has been successful cases where people have had to compensate the province for the cost of wild suppression. And, you can just look at the numbers in the previous years of how much the province has spent in certainly 2017, 2018, and we're talking, huge amounts of money. Now that's obviously all the wildfires combined, but there are legal ramifications and financial ramifications for if you're caught and charged with lighting a fire in a forested area, and just even the fines. Even if the fire doesn't escape, there are some pretty significant fines. We're talking to the thousands of dollars just for having a wildfire or just for having a campfire in a forested area. So, and it even goes to the cigarette butts. I think it's a $550 fine just for tossing a lit cigarette out a car window. So you can imagine having an open fire in the middle of the woods. You're running to $1,000 just in fines alone. So, but that being said, we know people are doing it. So, what are ways that we can get the messaging out to people? I always hate to use the enforcement side of trying to get people to change their behavior. I'd rather to educate people and understanding why it's important to them not to do that. Because to me, it just seems heavy-handed to say, don't do it because you're going to get a fine. No, don't do it because, these important factors of how it's going to impact your life and the life of people you care about if you continue on with this type of behavior.
Right. So in terms of the students going forward with this, if the guiding question is how might you as the Langford Fire Chief reduce risky fire behavior by youth, are there any other, is there anything else you'd like to share with the students in terms of data that might be helpful for them, facts, figures, or just in terms of messaging for your hopes for what they would accomplish on this day?
Well, I certainly think that one of the things that is new to the fire service, and I think it's new to everybody, but is the implications that climate change has on our local climate. I can look back at historical data and I can say, okay, I know based on these conditions and these years when our wildfire season is going to be, how we do a lot of data monitoring through FTS and other weather monitoring stations. We know with a pretty good certainty, based on I think there's 8 or 9 different factors we use, that if we have a fire, how fast it's going to spread, and to the depth it's going to spread, and how much of a problem it's going to be for us to extinguish. But we don't know with regards to climate change, how that's going to change, and do we need to not necessarily change our messaging, but do we need to change the timing of our messaging so that we're not in the middle of wildfire season before we're actually, really getting the message out there? Do we need to start spreading the message earlier? And how do we do that if the fires aren't happening? So, and what sort of messaging do we need to send in the wintertime? When we're talking about people fire smarting their houses, and we're talking about people getting conditioned into having campfires in the woods or tossing cigarette butts out the window, how do we change that behavior during the fall and winter so they're not doing it in spring and summer when it's become a habit for them? not recognizing that the risk has changed so dramatically.
Thank you. And how about, do you notice any differences that you just from your personal experience in terms of youth and what young people might respond to now versus what they might have responded to in the past?
Well, I think that youth certainly want, and I mean, obviously, I'm not a youth anymore, but one of the things is just the type of messaging, and like I said earlier, they want things to be pushed to them. They don't necessarily want to have to go search that information themselves. And so, how do we get that? How do we take the sign on the highway? How do we revamp that so that it resonates with the people that are driving by, and they go, oh, okay, that makes sense to me. Is seeing just a little flag at moderate or at high or extreme, if you don't understand what that means, you don't understand what the implications are, like, okay, so it's extreme. How is that different from moderate? How is that different from low? Obviously, people know there's a difference, but what is the difference and why is that should be an issue for us? So, realistically, what is the difference between high and extreme for most students? And so it's getting the message out there, and how do we change that messaging so people go, oh, I know that it's at high that there's, these typical factors are going to come into play, and I really, know that having those types of behaviors is going to be a risk to me. I know at extreme, it's even worse. And so we need to find some way to change that message so that people go, okay, I know what that means. I know that, even at my own house, I need to make sure that I'm, keep my grass cut short, that I'm not running an ATV out in the middle of the woods. I'm be careful cutting my grass, that a spark from a rock being hit by the blade doesn't cause a fire. All these types of things will come about if people look at the sign and go, hey, that means something to me. I know that I need to change my behavior.
So, if we can we talk a bit around, as you were talking, and it made me think that it would be helpful to have more information on, more specifically, when youth are in a situation where they're, let's say, in the forest or near the forest setting a fire. Is there a typical time at which this happens? Like, does it typically happen on a weekend night? And also, is it typical, like, would they be driving to the, let's say, a path? What's the situation surrounding the moment where they set a fire in the woods?
Yeah, I think typically there would be, in most cases, there would be a local spot that they would know. I wouldn't think a lot are driving to it because I think a lot of them don't want to highlight that there's a big group of people at that trailhead. So a lot of times they'll park at somebody they know nearby, and then they'll go into the local pathways that they know. And they're typically carrying, drinks and food and things like that. Yeah, typically weekends, Friday nights and Saturday nights are more common, and there may be some drug activity and stuff going on as well. So we're finding that it's going to be sort of early evening to later evening when they're likely to start, but we won't notice them till most times. If it's something where the fire is what we call darkened down, where you've knocked the flames down, but there's still heat, chances are it's not until 1 or 2 o'clock the next day that we'll actually get the call, because it'll take some time for the wind to pick up and for it to smolder and smolder and get bigger and bigger. And early afternoon, especially on a south-facing slope, is when the ground heats up to the point where these fires start to pop up, and they start to grow to the point where the smoke column comes above the tree canopy, and people are calling 911. So while we're not getting it until almost 24 hours later, the fires are probably being lit the night previous.
It's interesting. So even though people are going somewhere remote, it's not that remote. If they're walking in from someone's house, it actually is quite a danger to homes nearby.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking 500 meters, 800 meters off from a neighborhood, far enough that you're not super tired by carrying all your stuff in, but far enough that people aren't hearing you and calling the police, kind of thing. So, we're not for wildfire terms. That's no distance at all. That would easily travel and threaten homes even at the time that we're first getting the 911 calls.
Okay, thank you. I have no other questions. Are there any last words on your part?
No, I mean, I'm sure, we still got a couple of weeks ahead of time. I know they obviously want to edit this, but as different things come up, you know, uh, obviously, we're looking for the students' help. Again, I don't want to come on and say, you can't do this, stop making it happen, come up with strategies to deter this behavior altogether. Like I said, I don't encourage the behavior. We just need to know and need their help to help us get the message across to people, and how to prevent this from happening. We've been very, very fortunate here on the island for the last several years. We haven't had a significant fire. We've had some close calls. We managed to get on them quickly, but we haven't had the fires that we see in the interior. The biggest difference here on the island is that most of our fires are human caused because we don't get the lightning like they do in the interior. And while our forests are more dense and a little bit harder to ignite than the grasslands in the interior, they are far more difficult to fight because we have the rocky terrain, we have dense forest canopy, and it makes it a real challenge. And a lot of these fires, we can't even put firefighters on them. They have to be fought from the air, and which means that it's a real challenge for us to be able to protect homes if we can't get people into the areas to fight it. So we certainly look forward to their thoughts and their ideas and be able to help us revamp our messaging to the modern day, and hopefully to get it so that it resonates with the public, and we get keep our community safe.
Thank you.